slide 1, we're going to talk about what are habits, where they come from, and how they're formed in the brain. So habits are not always formed consciously. They can be formed unconsciously as well, which means they can work either to our advantage or to our disadvantage, depending primarily on our level of self-awareness. Basically, habits are an adaptation of the brain and its relation to new experiences. Okay, they're formed through a process known as neuroplasticity, which is just a fancy word to suggest that the brain can adapt to new experiences. So we can grow new habits. There used to be an understanding that neuroplasticity would stop. Basically, we couldn't learn much more past the age of about 30. Our habits were set in stone. Turns out that's not true. You can learn new habits all the way through your life. Doesn't matter how old you are, okay? So that's a fantastic point to start on. So that's a little bit about how they're formed. So I suppose one question that I'll sort of pose to the group is, I'll tell you the answer afterwards, but does anyone have a suggestion of how long it takes to form a habit in general? 2 weeks?
63 days or something like that.
Yeah, so both valid answers. You're pretty much all correct. So there isn't a specific time for how long it takes to form a habit. There's been a lot of literature out there that will tell you a lot of different things. But basically, a study suggested that it is somewhere between 18 days and 254 days. So I can't give you a more accurate answer than that. Otherwise, I'd be doing a disservice. So it's highly variable. That particular study, it was for a health habit of taking up, I think, 10 minutes of walking per day. So obviously that variability is different from person to person. It's different from habit to habit. But yeah, that was the example on that case. So 18 to 254 days. So quite a big significance we'd all agree with.
So you'd have to do something every day?
It was doing it 80% of the time was the cutoff mark to make a habit. So what's that, 4 out of 5 times? But well, yeah, across the week that'd probably be 5 out of 7, 6 out of 7. So quite a big difference. So we have to kind of look at why are some people more capable of forming habits. So how did those people end up doing it after 18 days? And why did some people, basically given the same information in that study, end up making progress after 250 days? So the answer is in something to do with that 2 words underlined there. So the reason some people take up habits easier than others, a very big part of it is to do with how our brains have developed and our ability to manage something called limbic friction, which most of you can see there. I tried to make the text as big as I could. So limbic friction is just a fancy term used by neuroscientists basically to describe the difference between our emotional brain and what that's telling us, and then the difference between the logical brain and what that's telling us as well. And as we all know, they can conflict. Emotion and reason are often not coupled to the degree we want them to be, and so that friction we feel, it can be described as limbic friction. So if you can see, I'll try and do my best to explain, but you've got, so basically the way that the brain's developed over time, it grew larger, and it also has grown particular connections in a pattern that favour our emotional brain over our logical brain. So what I mean by that, the reptilian brain is the black, it's our brainstem, that developed first, okay, if we date back lots and lots of years. That's basically responsible for survival instincts, very basic instincts of living, okay? After that, our emotional brain is in red. That's the limbic system. That developed second, okay? So that's, the processing of emotions, things like that, okay? Third and the final development was basically our neocortex, which is our rational component brain, okay? So that's developed last. The emotional brain came first, that's come second. So consequently, we have more connections from the emotional brain to the rational brain than the other way around, okay? So basically what I'm saying on this slide is that our logic tends to follow our emotion rather than our emotion tends to follow our logic, okay? It's not something you can particularly influence because that's the biology of it, okay? So just as a bit of a background.
So is that evolution?
That's evolution, yeah.
So our caveman ancestors didn't have emotions.
Yeah.
They just had basic instinct.
Yeah, basically. So, and that can be, I was going to give an example of a caveman, so that's a good point you brought up, Lana. But basically, sometimes that resistance we feel between emotional brain and logical brain is kind of uncalled for in today's society because our brain structures can't quite keep up with how fast we're pacing as a society. So things like anxiety and sort of overwhelm within our emotional system can be things like when we were cavemen, we weren't sure if we could trust strangers because they might be a threat to us and things like that. So the brain's slowly keeping up with the times that we're in, but unfortunately there's a bit of a fallback, and as I just suggested. So emotions come first, rationality tends to come second. So how well you can manage that connection between the emotional brain and the rational is a major factor in how well you can develop habits or how successfully you can implement habits. Basically, forcing yourself to do something that you don't want to do is an indicator of how well you'll do, if that makes sense. So the ability to pair that coupling of the emotional and the rational is called self-regulation. So how well you can self-regulate. And that's the indicator I'm talking about that determines how well you'll complete those habits. So a lot of words in that one, let's move on. So this is a nice little example used in contemporary psychology. It's an old sort of Buddhist story of the emotional elephant versus the rational rider, okay? So it works on the context of in each person there is a wild elephant or an emotional elephant representing your emotional brain, limbic system, and a rational rider sitting on top there, which represents the neocortex or your rational side, okay? So as I said before, we have a tendency for the emotional brain to take control of the rational brain. So that's a nice visual. And the difference in size of the elephant and the person captures the imbalance between our emotional limbic system and our rational neocortex, because that's the way we developed. Emotional first, rational second. All right, so we're still with us. So self-regulation in this context can be the ability to control the elephant, or the ability for the rider to control the elephant, okay? So you might experience this type of resistance if you know something's bad for you. For example, you might have a goal of reducing your alcohol intake, particularly on weekends. So you've said that to yourself, you're going to try and stick with that. Weekend comes around, your husband's just bought you a bottle of wine, given you a kiss and said, enjoy this. You know the agreement you've made with yourself, okay? So that's the rational brain saying, I'm not going to do this on weekends, I've made that decision. You have that tension between wanting to do it and knowing what's right for you. So the emotions is I want to, the rational is I know I shouldn't because it's not because I'm not trying to do that right now. So that's a little bit of an example of your ability to self-regulate, which is that second dot point there. So hashing once again, the ability to successfully adopt a habit is heavily influenced by self-regulation or the reduction of what we call limbic friction or emotional control. Yeah, it's because the nerve pathways often develop from the emotional brain to the neocortex. So even though it's bigger and we have more processing power, most of that control is influenced directly from the emotional side. So there's a connection there. And like I said, there's more capacity for rationale, but those fibres run from red to blue mainly, rather than from blue to red.
Yeah.
So, if that makes sense. Moving through. So, how do we control the elephant? What are some strategies we can use to improve our self-regulation? So, studies have shown that self-regulation is dependent on what we call cognitive resources, or basically just the available energy of the rational brain, the rational writer. Okay? Keep this slide nice and simple. So, studies also show that cognitive resources are largely dependent on two fairly simple things. Okay? So, your ability to practice self-regulation to increase your chance of adopting new habits. We need to emphasise that cognitive resources are very important in that aspect, and it's often reliant on nutrients for the brain, particularly glucose, which we know is good fuel for the brain, okay? And that can be something as simple as having a cup of juice in the morning or having some fruit throughout the day can actually help you manage your emotional brain. So it can be as simple as that. So there's one tip. Also, studies show that non-demanding physical activity is another way you can increase your cognitive resources or help self-regulate.
Why non-demanding?
Because it can't be too stimulating. It needs to be rest, basically. So I know that's a bit of a contradiction because we're exercising and I just mentioned rest, but basically rest for the logical brain. So you're not trying to compete, you're not trying to break your 5-kilometre running record, or you're not trying to win the grand final of your soccer match or footy match. So high intense situations don't necessarily do it to replenish your cognitive resources. The example that works best is a 5-minute walk without your phone and just switching off. Basically 5 to 10 minute walk, even 5 minutes can do it quite effectively as well.
And then can you do intense physical activity after that?
Yeah, that'll top it up. Intense exercise isn't going to take away from that. But basically, if you want to replenish what we're talking about here in terms of cognitive resources, these are just two things that they've proven to help out with that. So nutrients, glucose particularly, so sweets, sugars, but mainly fruits are important for this, and non-demanding physical activity. So we're not talking about workouts, we're just talking about a 5-minute walk. So quite a difference. All right, so to summarise, just that first part. So what we know so far, all right, try and make this simple. Habits are formed via neuroplasticity, which is just the change of the nervous system in response to experience, okay? So basically that's, in a somewhat simple form, that's how habits are formed in terms of the brain. So the nervous system can adapt to our experience. That's how we change our behaviour, essentially. The ability to build habits is largely influenced by limbic friction and our ability to practice self-regulation, okay? Self-regulation is maintained with preservation of cognitive resources, so glucose and non-demanding physical activity being the two most important ones. And, that's what I said down the bottom. Yep, which are associated with those two things at the bottom. All right, take a picture of that one. Okay, so Sometimes we try and take up a habit that's a little bit too much for us at the time. So when we try and have levels of high motivation, we often try and reach for the moon, reach for the stars and plan too much, or basically bite off more than we can chew, and we run into something that the elephant? The emotional elephant can't quite handle, okay? So the emotional brain can get overwhelmed in those circumstances. So let's do an example. You might feel really inspired one day. You've watched a video on YouTube or something like that of an inspirational 5-minute segment, and now you want to plan to run a marathon at the end of the year because your motivation is through the roof after watching that. So can you just go from a lazy Joe to running a marathon in 6 months? Probably not. I'd be impressed, but likely not, okay? So that's the emotional brain winning out against logic. When it comes time to training for this and motivation is back down to a regular level and it's not through the roof anymore, you're going to run into some aversion, some limbic friction, and one party is going to be saying, I don't want to do this, and the other part is saying, well, why did you do this in the first place, basically? So to basically summarise a few strategies or protocols to overcome what we call emotional aversion, to get you on track. And I'm not suggesting anyone actually try and run a marathon in 6 months, but if you're coming up with a little bit of resistance and you feel that you don't want to do it, but you really do, deep down you know it's good for you, so these are just some tips you can do for any habit at all. So I don't know if you guys can see that at the bottom, but when we run into an unpleasant activity, we're initially faced with some form of paralysis. We don't know what to do, and often the result is inaction, so you don't end up following through if you come into this. So step one will be lower the obstacle as much as possible, okay? So let's come up with a different example here that fits us a little bit better. So you're planning on 15-minute walk every day, let's say after dinner. So you feel like you don't want to do it one night. Doing something is better than doing nothing, so we're going to lower the obstacle. So we will say we won't do a 15-minute walk, we'll do a 5-minute walk, okay? So lower the obstacle. If you repeat this 20 to 30 times, okay, it's going to become more conditioned and easier each time. You'll have less emotional resistance every time you do it because you're working at a lower level. So the practice is to repeat that lower level up to 20 times first, and then gradually raise the bar from there. And then you can move up to 10 minutes and it will feel a lot easier than if you just start at 10 minutes or you start at 15 minutes. So it might sound like this takes a lot more time, but this is going to be a lot more effective way to build a habit than just jumping in the deep end and trying to stick. Like, this is why New Year's resolutions don't often work, because people try and think they'll change overnight, and then logic sets in and they fall back into the standard system. So we don't often rise to the level of our goals, we often fall to the level of our system or our habits. So this is just one strategy for dealing with that, essentially. So a little bit about the science of habits. Every habit follows 4 phases: cue, craving, response, and reward. And this is just a way, basically, that the brain can operate on the least effort possible. So there's a human behaviour law known as the law of least effort. So the body tries to make shortcuts. So habits are essentially mental shortcuts learned from experience. Cue, craving, response, and reward. So let's just run through an example down the bottom. So a cue might be that you get a notification on your phone. A craving is your desire to open your phone and check that notification. that's also the response. So you have opened your phone, you've clicked on the screen, you've gone into the app, you've read the message or whatever it may be, and your reward is that you've satisfied that need to check your phone. So now every time your phone goes off, your brain wants to do a shortcut. It goes straight from cue to reward basically, and it links those two. So now it's every time my phone goes off, I automatically want to check it, scroll through the message, and then know that I've read it, and now I'm happy, okay? So every time you go through cue, craving, response, and reward, there's something that we call, so each time you practice a bad habit, it becomes more conditioned in a feedback loop. So your brain's always trying to analyse your environment, predict the future, create new responses, and then that's how essentially how the feedback loop begins. So another example, very simple one, we probably most of us do it every morning. You wake up in the morning, you feel tired, it's, what is it in Harvey Bay at the moment, 8 degrees? 5. So I know this is true for me at least. I go straight to the kettle, I click the button because I'm feeling tired. So my craving, so the cue is I'm feeling tired, the craving is I want to get to the kettle and have caffeine as quickly as possible. My response is doing that, walking across the kitchen, pressing the button on the kettle, and then eventually the reward will be that I've had my fix of caffeine, I feel better, and now the feedback loop will be waking up feeling tired relates directly to drinking coffee. And we just repeat it day by day by day.
So would you have to do that 20 or 30 times for that once?
A habit?
Yeah.
Probably, yeah, but before it forms into an automatic habit or behaviour. Yeah. Yeah, well, between 18 and 265, but some habits are a lot easier, so yeah, 20 to 30 is probably accurate, yep. All right. Yep, so the reward then becomes associated with the cue. So a simple thing like a light switch, you walk into a room, the room's dark, you got a desire to see, you flick the switch, and now walking into a room means you're looking for the nearest light switch without thinking every time. So very simply, these are just some factors that will influence our habits in a positive way if we take control of these 2 points here. The amount of control an individual possesses over their behaviour. Did I say processes? Yeah. All right, possesses over their behaviour. Essentially, that's what we talked about in slide 1 or 2 about can we force ourselves to do things we commonly find uncomfortable, and that pairing of self-regulation and overcoming that limbic friction, all right?
Is that the comfort zone?
Yeah, basically. Yeah, yep, and it comes back to that law of least effort. So we'll always try and make something easier and try and find a shortcut where we can. So the amount of control someone possesses over their behaviour, and that can be related to, in terms of habits, how are you going to do it? So we're thinking with the rational brain now, what's the plan, okay? And the strength of an individual's intention to perform their behaviour. And we'll talk a little bit about intention at the end, but basically that's your why. Why am I doing it? Why do I want to adopt this healthy habit? But like, what type of person do I want to become? What activities do I want to be doing in the future? So that's your motivation. Okay. So we're trying to figure out how do we perform new habits in the best way possible now. So we're getting straight to it here. We're going to, so obviously there's cue, craving, response, reward. So this one's a little bit of a shortcut. Cue, routine, reward. So it's cue, craving, response, reward. So we'll start with the cue, okay? So we said at the start, behaviour change starts with self-awareness. Most of us aren't even aware of the cues that we have for our habits. So being aware, if you're trying to change your behaviour, of where the cue starts can be one of your biggest friends. So research shows that more often than not, the most common cues are time and location. So if you think about this, let's go back to the example of I'm trying to reduce drinking. Your cue might be you open your fridge, you look down to your third shelf and you see a beer or a wine there straight away, okay? Is this going to help you try and quit drinking or not? No. So in that instance, that would be location or your environment is something that you can really manipulate in a way that makes bad habits hard and good habits easy. So environmental setting, and I mean how you set your environment, whether it be at home, at the office, whatever it is, whatever you're trying to improve on, can be a really underestimated factor on how to adopt some really good habits and how to avoid some bad habits. They did a study in an American high school where they had two bubblers situated in the high school cafeteria, and the study was designed to see if just moving the bubblers around in the cafeteria, so that it was basically if they could restructure the environment, if they could get the kids to drink a lot more water or adopt a habit of drinking more water. And they put the bubblers next to the doors, so a common area where kids would walk in and out and a lot more visibility, and the kids drank about 2 times more water, just like that. So the motivation hasn't changed, the reason hasn't changed, it's just simply the cue, and it can be that simple to get the habits started in the right direction. And time can be another thing, but we'll mainly focus on location or the environment. So you might even think in terms of drinking, if I want to quit drinking, am I going to put that beer can right at the back of the fridge or right at the front of the fridge? So you'll put it right at the back of the fridge where you can't see it, okay? So a little tip, if you're trying to form a good habit, make your cue as obvious as possible. So we might say keeping your gym gear somewhere where you can see it the night before, or make it easy access, basically. So that make it obvious if you're trying to perform a good habit, and basically hide it as much as possible if you're trying to remove a habit. So you can't kick that cycle off because the cycle must start with the cue. All right, so something down the bottom, some fancy words, but yeah, there's a basically protocol known as implementation intention, and it's basically when you decide you're going to do a habit before it comes time to do it. So you reduce the willpower required to actually start the habit because you've previously decided that you are going to do it at this time, at this location. An example of that would be if you go into the gym the next morning, you take your shoes out, you put them on the end of the bed with your towel and your water bottle. So it becomes, basically you don't have to use as much willpower to get that cycle started. And they've done heaps of research on that, and that's another handy tool that you guys can walk away with, hopefully. So implement your intention prior to actually doing it. If you know it's important, and for example, it's cold in the morning, you wake up, all you want to do is stay in bed. So that might be something you've decided the night before. All right, so that was the cue. We're going to move on to the craving, which is also known as our motivation for why we're doing what we're doing, essentially. So let's have a look here. We've got extrinsic motivation, and your second example here is intrinsic goal-based motivation. So you might have heard some of these terms. Extrinsic motivation is an external stimulus or a reward or something that's motivating you at the end of your goal. So in this case, it can be anything. So something like the person in the gym that comes the most amount of times in 1 month or 1 week wins a prize. So that's right. So you're not motivated to change because you want to. You're motivated to change because there's some reward or a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow that you think you can cash in on, basically. So it's not good for sustained effort. This is generally a weak motive compared to intrinsic motivation. And a little bit about that third point. So when we achieve a goal, the brain releases a neurotransmitter, a happy chemical known as dopamine, which you may have heard of. And this is at the end in the reward phase. So when I said checking your phone, once the notification goes off, you've checked your phone, you become happy for about 10 seconds because you've satisfied that need or that desire. You get a little hit of dopamine in the brain and you feel good. So your brain's going to pair feeling good with checking your phone, okay? Basically, if you achieve your goal with an intrinsic mindset or motivation, the brain doesn't release as much reward chemical. So you might be happy for half the amount of time, or you might be half as happy as if you were to achieve that same goal. And it come from an internal drive or deep desire to basically benefit yourself. And then we are less likely to complete that positive feedback loop, or we're less likely to do it again because the reward wasn't particularly satisfying. All right. Which brings us across to intrinsic motivation, or intrinsic goal-based motivation. This is an internal stimulus. It comes from your own desire to do better, or your own drive, your own reasons for doing what you're doing, whatever they may be. It's much better for sustained effort compared to extrinsic motivation. It's a reasonably strong motive, which inspires the effort. So, and this is an interesting point here on that third one. So, humans, as we know, are the only animal that have the ability to see the future, or, well, predict future successes, think about our future, okay? And that's part of the responsibility of the rational brain, the prefrontal cortex. So other animals don't have that ability at all. So that's a fantastic thing. But with goal-based motivation, we always have this very large desire within us, our own personal reasoning for wanting to achieve a goal in the future. And in a general sense, it means we're not quite satisfied until we get to that point 1 month down the track, 2 months down the track, 6 months away when your marathon's coming up. So we have a little bit of discontent in the present until that desire is met. So with people that set intrinsic goals, or just goals in general, it's kind of you work, you achieve it, you get that desire, it slowly wears off, and then you have to set a new goal. And then people become goal junkies, basically. They just have to achieve the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. So compared to extrinsic motivation, good. Is it the best way or the best type of motivation? No. So goal-based motivation is good, but not the greatest, and I'll continue on from there. So another fancy terminology coming at you. This one is called Hedonic Adaptation. That little blue square on the left says the Hedonic Treadmill. It's basically where you have a desire to do better. So you set a goal, you strive for it, you obtain it, you get a release of dopamine, so you enjoy it. Your brain adapts, you're back to normal again, and then you desire more, and that's that habit, that's that loop of sort of what I referenced as becoming a goal junkie, essentially. So hedonic adaptation basically is that ability for your brain to experience joy and then return to normal. And so there's been plenty of studies on this. So an example I would give might be something like you buy a new car, you're super happy with that, you think it's the best thing in the world, and that will probably last, I don't know, person to person different, maybe 1 month, maybe 2 months, and then you're back to normal. And then that might have been your goal. You might have been saving up for the car for a long time, you're really motivated to do it, you bought it, you get joy from it, your brain adapts, and then we're back to square one. So that's kind of the only downfall of goal-based habits, as opposed to journey-based habits or journey-based motivation. So on that right side, that's the solution. This is your best, basically best point of call in terms of motivation is intrinsic journey-based motivation. Okay, and this more so requires a vision of the activities you would like to be completing in the future. So not a goal, it's more of a vision or an understanding of the habits you'd like to have in your lifestyle, who you want to become, or what activities you want to do. Okay, so there's no end point. You're not saying I want to become this or have these habits set up by this time. It's more of an ongoing vision. So with that, rather than setting goals, we tend to set milestones just to check our progress with this. So the upside of this is we don't get that hedonic treadmill of striving, obtaining, enjoying, adapting, and then desiring more. We basically have an increased happiness throughout the entire process because we're striving for it. And that's what gives us that positive feedback, rather than achieving and then resetting. So, yeah, so it basically starts with happiness, prioritizing happiness over success or happiness over rewards, rather than rewards being the source of your happiness, okay? So a little bit different. All right, so that's all good and well to have that type of motivation, but obviously we know motivation is a little bit of a roller coaster. Sometimes it goes up and sometimes it comes down, okay? So imagine having a hose that's bent in the middle, okay? So to get good water flow out the other side of the hose, there's two options here. You can either blast up the water at the pump and try and pump more water through the hose and create a lot of tension in the hose. Or option two would be you just go out, unkink the hose and straighten it. Okay, you don't have to add any more pressure to the situation. And so sometimes that's a good, useful tool to do in terms of motivation. So you don't need to have extra motivation. It's not always the answer. Sometimes it's reducing your action into more manageable steps. So an example of that, we've got down the bottom is the 2-minute rule. And this is a fantastic way for people beginning to start new habits. And we kind of touched on it earlier, of breaking your initial habits down into smaller steps. So the 2-minute rule is, say, if you wanted to set a habit goal of reading for 10 minutes a night, or you want to read 20 pages of a book every night, you're trying to become a better reader. Rather than becoming overwhelmed and saying, no, I don't have 20 pages left in me tonight, I'm really tired, just begin the habit anyway and do it for 2 minutes. Because what they often find is you won't just do it for 2 minutes, you'll probably end up doing it for 5 minutes or 10 minutes anyway, but it takes more willpower to decide to do something in most cases than to actually proceed with doing it. So, and they've done research on an example of attending the gym. So it takes more willpower to decide to attend the gym than to do the workout in most cases, which is very interesting. But that's the human brain, I suppose. So the 2-minute rule just means force yourself to do it for 2 minutes because that appears a lot easier. But what often happens is we do it for more than 2 minutes anyway. So it's just kind of a way to trick your brain into doing something you don't want to do. All right, so I've only got a little bit to go on this one. So this is just a very quick slide explaining the various stages of behaviour change. Most behaviour change studies take up between 6 months and 12 months to get sort of conclusive results on, and that's for any sort of healthy habit intervention where people are trying to take up behaviours. So it starts generally with pre-contemplation, so not quite understanding the benefits or not seeing why I should take up a behaviour. After that, we move through to, okay, I'm open to understanding the benefits of this behaviour or this habit. So we're contemplating making the change, but we're not quite there yet. After that comes determination. So we've struck up some motivation now. We've decided that we're going to do it, and we just need to move forward to the planning phase and executing the action. So we've executed the action. We've begun to slowly build this habit into our life. We're making some good progress. And then we have a relapse, okay? And this is a very common part, nothing to be scared of in terms of behaviour change or starting new habits, is the relapse. And this has been pretty well researched. It's a very high amount people run into a relapse. And I think it's also a high percentage of people that don't go back and basically they fall off after their first relapse. So maintenance is a very important factor in the behaviour change process. So to complete that cycle. Also, one thing to mention with this, so this is a step-by-step process, it's a theory, but as you can see, it can take quite a bit of time to move through those points. And it's a more effective way to go all the way through each step rather than try to jump from pre-contemplation to action. Probably not going to work too well for you. So something to think about there. So the process should be gradual, not incredibly quickly, basically. All right, this slide has a lot of information, but I basically just want to say what that first one says. So enhancing the performance of a behaviour, it's important to consider the consequences prior to acting. So we kind of talked about contemplating and being determined before you jump into action. So I want to talk a little bit about contemplating the benefits of exercise. So we'll skip straight to the next slide for this one. So this is a study that they did in the US with 4,000 people, adults of all ages, and the habit was trying to include a 10 to 12 minute brisk walk each day, okay? These are some of the results that they researched. So fairly big study, really great data on this one. So they found that people increased confidence, improved their mood, had greater empathy and attentiveness to others, reduced the risk of all-cause mortality by roughly 15%, improved memory performance and cognitive function, improved blood flow, reduced the risk of a stroke or a heart attack, improved sleep, particularly when walking in the first 2 hours of the day in the mornings, and also improves blood sugar control and reduces the chance of diabetes. So from the point of an exercise physiologist, where my job is to help promote exercise and healthy habits to overcome things like chronic conditions, we've got a few chronic conditions just there in terms of reducing the risk of a heart attack and diabetes just by uptaking 10 minutes of brisk walking, not running, just brisk walking each day. So that's something to contemplate if that's a behaviour you want to change. So understanding what are the benefits before I jump headfirst into this is going to ultimately affect that behaviour performance. So what positives can I expect? All right, so I'll leave you with 5 pretty simple points. I know we covered a lot of stuff today, but these are just 5 simple steps to summarise in terms of forming successful habits. So number 1, it starts with self-awareness. So increase your awareness about your current habits. Try to identify your cues, your cravings, your response and your reward, and just become mindful of that. Just watch the way you act on a day-to-day and you might surprise yourself. Learn to listen to your logical brain. This is an important one because we have an influence from the emotional brain, but the logical brain is the one that's going to plan out the behaviour and execute it, okay? Number 3, managing your environment. for easy application. So basically reducing the amount of times you might see alcohol in the fridge, or increasing the amount of times you'll see your runners, so put them next to the door, things like that, okay? That's a really big one, and that can be done fairly easily. Having a strong why and a strong how, so not just motivation, so that intrinsic journey-based motivation, where we focus on the vision rather than the goal, and how we're going to do it. So try and come up with a plan, breaking it into small steps. If you need to use the 2-minute rule and do 2 minutes at a time, it's better than doing nothing. So that's your how. And starting small and building up, as I just said. So back to one of those earlier slides, if you come into emotional overwhelm with taking up any behaviour and you feel like you can't do it, we reduce the size, we practice it 20 to 30 times, and then we slowly increase the size after that. And that will help you stick to long-term habits. It'll also make sure if you're trying to develop a new habit, you're on that 18 days side of things, not the 254 days side of things. I know that was a lot of information, so hopefully those 5 points can be some takeaway messages from all of that talk. But yeah, that's all I had. That's all I had. Only 47 minutes on the topic. So yeah, I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.
So it's not really a habit, it's more about when you're talking about the lateral and the emotional brain. So going back to a marathon runner, say you did want to start running. So I know for me, if I've tried to run before, I can do about 50 metres and then my lungs start bursting and I feel like I can't breathe. And so is that my brain telling my body to stop, or is that my body telling my brain to stop and have a rest? Because obviously you have to push past that. If you mind over matter, I don't know. Do you just push past it and keep running, or do you stop, or
it depends? That's a particular one. So that does depend on the severity of the symptoms. So I'm not going to sit here and advocate mind over matter, because it's important to listen to your body. So there's not particularly a straightforward way of answering that.
Is it the brain telling your body to stop, or is it your body telling your brain to stop?
In that instance, probably your body telling your brain to stop. So in which case would be take with a little bit more caution. Yeah, that's not emotional, that's physical, yeah.
So I was saying to Jocelyn this morning, because she's talking about doing park run on Saturday, and she's not a runner, and I was telling her about that. But if I'm in a class and my lungs are bursting, I don't stop.
Yeah.
Because I'm outside in a different environment.
Yeah.
And I'm by myself, I can stop if I want to, whereas in a class, I don't.
Well, that's it.
Jocelyn with you. Sorry? You need Jocelyn. It's just, yeah.
That's an interesting one,
it's not
yeah.
really, I suppose it's not really a habit thing, but to get a good habit,
yeah.
it's routine, I suppose, and pushing past barriers
yeah.
to get the habit.
So there might be an emotional component of it. The suggestion would probably be start walking and then increasing your speed and just do what you can tolerate, and then try and push that gradually 20 to 30 times and work your way up to running. But yeah, there might be a bit of an emotional, if you can do it and you know you can do it, yeah, there might be a little bit of that involvement there.
It's weird, isn't it? The body and the brain.
They don't communicate.
But you could also be that there is something wrong, so...
Yeah, that's what I mean, yeah.
Could be what, sorry?
Could be something wrong, so... if you're
Oh, no, I think it's just not laziness, it's just taking the easy way out, stop it. Because I'm sure that once you find the rhythm, and I know that I can do an RPM class, you push through shred and all that sort of thing, and once you push past and find a rhythm of breathing and running, I mean, running's the only thing that I've had the example of, but
Yeah.
I don't think physically there's anything wrong, it's just
How
taking
long,
the easy option.
sorry. How long does it take to break a habit?
That's variable as well. The behaviour change process is the same for building something or breaking something, because, like I said, habits work for you or against you. So if we look at some... Yeah, sorry?
Look at some experiment, like stopping coffee, you know, and see how long
Yeah.
it takes. And I'm really
Rest when you get up.
So it depends on, like your motivation, the reason for doing it. So you'd probably have to have a pretty strong reason for quitting a habit, but highly variable. Yeah, there's no particular answer.
All right. So 3 o'clock munchies,
Yeah.
when I open the fridge and go, what can I eat?
Like a healthy option for lunch. Like I have a handful of nuts when I have in the afternoon when I get hungry. I've got a little handful of nuts,
Yeah.
and that gets me through to dinner time.
So is that,
Thanks.
so I do that for
So
20 to
you
30.
influence the cue. Yeah. So if you're trying to quit a behaviour, yep, try and make it. Try and basically hide the cue, and it's the opposite for if you're trying to build something. You make it obvious.
Yeah.
If you're trying to quit something, you identify what the cue is and then start there, and then try and remove it from their head, basically.
Same as drinking, so if you don't have a beer in the fridge in the first place, and don't have the sweets in the cupboard, then you're not.
Don't buy it,
Yeah.
and you won't eat it.
Yeah,
And
and
laundry side.
same thing,
Yeah.
understanding the consequences as well. What's the perceived benefit of not drinking? And educate yourself on that first, and that'll help a little bit more with motivation for doing it. If you have a reason, it makes it a lot easier. Hopefully.